Greetings, sir and sirettes, and welcome back to From the Depths with me, Lathrix, and of course, welcome back to the sandbox mode, in which we have a lot of work to do. Now, sadly, over the weekend, I was forced to take a little break away from YouTube, away from recording videos in general, because, honestly, life just didn't like me all that much. And now the weekend is over, I am desperate to get building again, and ultimately make some more content. So today, let's get some work done. We are going to be building two craft, the first of which is actually close to being finished despite the fact it's so small, which is the blood parasite. Now this little spiky thing is going to be honestly absolutely annoying for anyone fighting it. It's going to have some laser resistance, it's going to have some shielding, but it probably won't be too difficult to kill. However, at its current cost, it's only 10,000 resource, and it's not going to be particularly difficult to keep on making. The really annoying factor, however, is how it's going to fight. This little annoying bugger is going to be able to create two of our nuke drones at any given time, and it's also got long-range cruise missiles, which do happen to have flares, and the radars, which means they are going to distract other missiles on their way to the target. The idea of this craft is, in fact, it's going to be a sub rather than a ship or a flyer, despite the fact it has so much fire currently coming out of its butt, and even that will provide some annoyance towards the enemy. My sort of lore idea for this is that this is our scavenger vehicle. This lovely thing goes out and collects the mainframes floating in the water and scavenging anything of worth. As you can see, I have already sort of adorned it with a lot of mainframes, having a nice spa treatment before being used in our nuke drones, which honestly sounds even crueler now I've said it out loud. We capture the mainframes from the enemy, we shove them into our suicide vehicles, and then we send them off against their former comrades. Remember though, we are the good guys, we are the righteous of all of the forces in this game. So I'm going to do a little bit of work on this. I'm already very close to finishing it. The next vehicle we will do a little bit more on camera, which hopefully will be a hovercraft, the first one of the season. Basic AI is now installed, so this should go forwards and turn. Nothing else, just that. And is it trying to turn? Yes, it is, and it's successfully doing so. Not the fastest thing in the world, but considering we have one single fuel engine powering this entire thing, I think we're doing just fine. Okay, the hydrofoils have just been added. And without the other PID systems, that looks really weird, but it is working correctly. The joy of building in a series of levels. Levels, stages, in a certain order. So the problem here is that I started designing this some days ago, before my forced break from YouTube and building and all that, and I can't remember what I wanted to do in terms of styling the back half of this craft. I know I wanted that spin block, and we do have the spin block saved here, so I can place that whenever I want to, but I don't want it to stop as suddenly as it did in the past. I clearly had just placed that as a placeholder so that I could save it and then build it again. Now, one idea I do have is perhaps we could use the light blocks. Now, the problem with the light blocks is twofold. First of all, they're 100 material each. That makes them over twice as expensive as the heavy armor, so they are very expensive. The second problem is that they detonate with quite a nasty explosion when they're hit. The whole point of the light blocks, however, would mean that I could put the spin block in the center, and then have what is essentially floating blades going around the back section of this craft, which would look really cool, and we could decorate them as blades, like proper blades, or something like that to fit the theme, which would be really cool. It's just, I don't want this to be an expensive craft. The whole point of it is to just tie up the enemy with worthless vehicles, and just annoy them at long range with distracting missiles. This is a vehicle which is essentially going to poke the enemy with a stick. A little lighter and things are looking a lot better. It can now hold its altitude incredibly well, and I've made it so it slightly angles forwards. This way, when it's creating the two separate nukes, they should be built on a slightly different plane, even though, of course, they are being built at different altitudes anyway via the regular settings. This just makes it a little bit less likely that they hit each other when they're created. So let's spawn in an Atlas very quickly and see if this all works. It really should do. Okay, I can already see the problem. This second nuke is too high, and thus it's out of range of the repair tentacles. That is very annoying. Also, it doesn't seem like more repair tentacles would actually help. It's just because this is such a long craft, it can't continue to build until the centerpiece is done, so there's just nowhere... boom, for the repair tentacles to actually latch onto. Since it can only repair blocks attached to a block which already exists, except for the origin block, of course, which can be built from nothing.
Turning off.
Okay, the Atlas has been spawned in, so... well, at least both of them are actually being repaired this time. Although they are far too close. Okay, so I think I'm going to do is put this one behind us rather than on top. That way, they should be spawning very far away from each other, because look, that is way too close. The chance of those two colliding is actually incredibly high. Hello, Atlas. And the missiles just come careening past. So we have two being created at the top and one being created at the back. So this way, we should be able to get all of this set up incredibly quickly. And yes, I have currently turned off the engine by simply allowing the fuel to run out. That was totally intentional and not a mistake. It's kind of fun though, watching it sort of half float. Okay, there goes all three of the nuke drones. I'm happy enough with how fast they're being made. We could make these drones much smaller, honestly, but I am not here to build the most efficient designs in the world. I am here to have fun and derp around, and that is exactly what these little nuke drones are. And because the enemy died, and they are ignoring salvage, they all just fall harmlessly to the floor. I've also noticed that the game's audio is turned off. I have no idea why this has happened. Okay, we are pretty much done now with the Soul Cage. This is the finished version. So, a few last minute changes, the first of which is that I've made the missiles significantly longer range, and secondly, I have added some wooden armor and heavy armor on the inside, the wooden armor around the AI to protect against EMP, and the heavy armor to protect against shots trying to kill the ammo barrels, since this isn't a particularly well-armored vehicle, as it is a little bit too small for that. It is decently armoured for its size, but it is still pretty darn small, and will be shredded by pretty much anything which actually aims at it correctly. So I've decided we are not going to be adding shields to this. It was a hard decision, but the reason is, it only costs 14,000 resources. Adding the extra engines and the actual cost of the shield components, I just don't think is worth it. 300 per shield projector. We would need at minimum 5, maybe 6 for a decent amount of coverage on the top section. And that would cost a fortune. It's just not worth the cost to protect something so cheap. I've also decided this could be our first civilian vehicle, since technically speaking, it's just a scavenger. It's a salvage vehicle sent after a battle to go ahead and collect mainframes and anything useful. So I do like the idea of no shields and perhaps even no laser protection, if we go ahead and find that. There we are, the laser warners and the smoke dispensers. They're not quite as expensive, so I may end up adding these anyway, although it will mean we need a little bit extra fuel, which we do need anyway, so that's not too much of a big deal. So yeah, there we go, the soul cage is now finished. It's going to be a throwaway unit we spawn in just for fun, because honestly, we just needed something to make the tactical nuke vehicles, because sending them on their own just felt a little bit weird, so we send in one or two of these into a battle. They hide out in the deep end of the water, occasionally throwing nukes at the enemy and trying to avoid them at all costs. So let's move on to our second small vehicle. Okay, so this is going to be a hovercraft, and the turret I've just placed is a bit of a placeholder just for size. This is one of my most early designs when it comes to advanced cannons, and it's not been built all that efficiently, but it does certainly work. So my idea is that we're going to have one main gun on the back, still trying to keep things small, which will have most of the mass of the armor. We then have quite a steep slope at the back here, and a slow slope going all the way to the front, so not particularly steep. Then at the front we will have torpedoes or missiles, most likely torpedoes honestly, as we won't have enough to be that effective, but having a couple of torpedoes always helps, because it means we can counter subs. So we have those here and here. Then I want the front to split into two major sections, so basically two spikes similar to the soul cage, but a little bit more pronounced. After that, we'll just see how we go, but honestly, that's the major goal. There's not going to be all that much to this craft, it's all going to be about the turret. And yes, we are going to have most likely a minigun style turret, as we simply haven't built one in a while, and I sort of miss them. We are simply just going to avoid using fragment, so most likely just armor penetration rounds, which will be countered by shields, but will also counter very, very fast targets, and will just make it an absolute nuisance. So, let's get to work. Okay, so the start of the hull is now being built, and I think we're going to go with a hover tank type of design, very similar to the Bloodletter, the lovely little thing over there. So hopefully this will be pretty good. I've also decided we are going to be using a modified version of the Malal's Will secondary cannon, the advanced cannons, which we had at the very start. These lovely ones over here, which gave the blue beam of death. So hopefully this will just be a nice little armoured box, it will go into the battle and will bring one very powerful weapon, and because of the low cost and volume, we can pretty much spam produce these, and the gun they carry is a pretty good counter pretty much everything type of weapon. Now, I am trying to avoid minigun style advanced cannons, but having one or two in my force, especially now that we're fighting enemies which also use this type of weapon, I think it's perfectly understandable, plus it's a bit of fun. So, just how big are we going to make this thing, I think is the major question. I don't think much bigger than we have here. It's already almost 6,000 cost, and it's already over 1,000 volume. If we can keep this under 3,000, I will be very, very happy, because then it's just so cheap. It's just a nice throwaway unit in a game which so far I've built very largely and very expensively. Okay, so pros and cons this early into the build. The first pro, which I'm actually a little bit surprised by, is that it's going to be very, very heavily armoured, even from the sides and this front section, which is likely to be the weakest part of the tank. It's going to have, at minimum, 3 layers of regular metal armour, and we probably have enough space to even do a little bit of space armour, so that we can resist things like heat shells. Although, I really should go ahead and start using some specialist armor types so that, you know, we can counter it more successfully, more reliably. But even so, there's going to be a lot of armor even on the turret cap. The turret cap may be one of the more heavily armored turret caps I've ever made, excluding things made out of heavy armor, considering this isn't even finished yet. Naturally, the phone goes off whilst I was trying to explain things, but at least that allowed me to start rolling the barrel. So the other positive is the weapon choice. Because we are going with a 75mm advanced cannon, which of course is a minigun style of weapon which fires a lot, and we are also going with torpedoes, this means we're going to be able to counter a lot of enemy craft. There's not going to be all that many types of enemies which can completely avoid our firepower. That's not to say this will take out many enemies, it's going to be quite a weak distraction, but it is going to be able to at least fight them, it's going to stand a chance. So I think something like this, mass-produced, could provide a backbone to our military. And in fact, I think that's the exact role this is going to be, a fast response and just grunt of our legion. So the cons of the craft, the first of which is that it's just not going to be able to put up enough of a fight to take out godly opponents unless we use a lot of them, but that does mean in battles where we spam this vehicle, we are going to lose a few. Now that's not awful for our resources, but it is a reliable loss every battle. That's just the issue with building smaller vehicles, honestly. Even if I were to add shields and everything else to this, it would still end up dying quite a lot versus things like the Perforator. In addition to this, it's a type of vehicle I've built before. It's very, very similar to the Bloodletter, at least in terms of functionality, so it's not my most original design. In fact, it's one of my least original since I have built hover tanks several times in the past, but they are just one of my favourite vehicle types in the game. I adore building hovercrafts which use both the rotor blades and the PID system together to make them a little bit weird, and it's just a very fun build to actually create, and it's also fun to simply use against the enemy. PID system with absolutely no tweaks to it, and yeah, it's actually working. Okay, so I've actually balanced this surprisingly well, despite the fact it's a floating block of metal. Why must you prove me wrong? Okay, I've just placed the PID systems and I haven't touched them yet. Let's see if this thing can actually stay stable throughout 2 different turns. Well, it's sort of going off to the side, but yeah, that is doing what it's meant to be doing, so hurrah for that. It's actually pretty quick as well, surprisingly, even though apparently I don't quite have enough engine power. I am very okay with that. A few tweaks and that should be very, very stable, although leaving it with a bit of tilt and a little bit of a pitch problem may make it harder to hit by enemy detection systems. Well, weapons being fired via enemy detection systems. It seems like when it turns, it sort of tilts to that side, which causes it to very slightly rise, which then the PID system overcompensates for. This is why PID systems are so finicky. Oh no, a Marauder has spawned! Okay, that seems absolutely fine. I was a little bit worried since we're only using 75mm rounds, but yeah, that's absolutely fine. May do better once we have aim point selection as well, because for some reason, you really hate the center of this craft. Recoil seems absolutely fine though, so very, very happy indeed. The cheapo tank is pretty much done and ready for mass production. I've added some extra armor, I've sorted out the detection systems, and I've even worked with the PID system a little bit. So ultimately, I'm very, very happy with this. After a few tests against enemies of a similar cost, it does incredibly well. However, the one thing I'm not entirely happy with is the gun itself. Not only is it a little bit generic, I have been using miniguns for a long time, even though I have took a break with the latest few builds, I'm just not happy with it. The main issue is, of all the shell types, the fragment shell is significantly better. It is by far the most reliable and the most damaging, but I simply don't want to use this because it's being updated so heavily soon, and the fact it's just by far the main shell type I use. I'm just not comfortable using it yet again on what is already a fairly basic design for me. So I tested out pretty much every other type of shell: high explosive, even flak, regular kinetic shells, high armor penetration shells, and the only other two viable shells in the end, at least which were reliable, were the kinetic shells and the graviton rams, or is it graviton? There it is, graviton, as in gravity. Okay then, so this is actually a really fun shell to use, but it's not the most reliable thing in the world, and it can cause matches to become a little bit insane. Let me show you. Yep. And into space the enemy godly design goes. So, yeah, that's the reason why I'm not going to be using the graviton rams. They are a little bit on the, weird side, to say the least. So here we are, now even further into space. I wonder how high up we are currently. So that was the Conga from the Deepwater Guard, now safely floating away in space, as I struggle to hit it since the AI can't quite figure out how space works. So, yeah. It's actually so high up, you can't even see it. There it is, just about a blue sort of blur in the distance. One final test of our tank, so let's have a quick look, see who we can fight then. Ideally, we want something of a very, very similar volume. The Proctor is a godly design from the Onyx Watch, which I believe has a cram cannon and a few shields, if I'm recalling correctly. Its volume is also 2,500, and honestly, we're just testing out the damage of our weapon, and honestly, them having shields is pretty good for us. So let's go ahead and see how we do. Torpedoes have already been released, and there we go, the shield hard countering those shells. Thankfully, some of them are getting through, and already taking out its cram cannon. Okay, considering it's made of metal, and considering it had shields, that was pretty good, honestly. Very, very similar volume as well, since our volume is 2,800, so we are just a little bit bigger than the enemy. Okay, not a terrible showing. I wasn't overly impressed with these designs today until I realised something. They really are ridiculously cheap, and mass-producing these would be even easier than I originally thought. Everything you see in front of you, all combined, costs less than a single Bloodthirster version 3, and significantly less than the Wordbearer or the Perforator. So even if we lost everything here, it's the equivalent of losing one larger vehicle. They are incredibly disposable, and even if they completely fail, we lose almost nothing. And honestly, if we were using frag shells, which I may end up using anyway, these tanks are highly effective, and if nothing else, the subs are just hilarious to watch, and the fact they shoot nukes is also kind of funny. I also realised something. One of the reasons why our nukes were being made so slowly is because the sandbox mode actually uses localised resources, and not the overall resources, centralised resources, which we are using in the campaign, which means they kept on running out of materials whilst they were building, and then the game gave them more materials, but this giving process was so slow, it simply couldn't keep up with how fast they were building the nukes, which explains so much. So in the campaign, they will be building significantly quicker. So, with that, I'm afraid I am all out of time for today's episode. The next episode will be back in the campaign straight away, as I really want to finish off the White Flyers and move on against the Grey Talons. I hope you all had a lovely weekend, and I hope to see you in the next episode. So, of course, if you have enjoyed, then likes, favourites, shares, comments, all that good stuff helps out me, helps out the channel, and most importantly, shows that From the Depths is a series you wish to see continued in the future. Also, got to admit, that looks kind of cool. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.